Okay, so this is for the next step in the seam sample. So right now you should have the pivot here, and you should have put your two pieces right sides together, and you should have sewn at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna do these last two steps here. So it says in seam allowance, line edge up with presser foot. So you're gonna take the edge that's in your seam allowance. So this right here is your seam allowance from when you sewed the two pieces together, okay? What seam allowance is it's space from your stitches to the edge of your fabric. Inside of your clothing, you have seam allowance like this. This is the seam allowance, okay? And so inside your clothing, you can see this fancy stitching right here. This is called serging, and it's a type of seam finish. And so what you're gonna do is you're gonna do a seam finish in the seam allowance here. And this one that we're gonna do is called a zigzag. So it says in seam allowance, line edge up with presser foot. So you're gonna take your edge and you're gonna line it up with the edge of the presser foot instead of the 5/8. So you're just gonna put it right like that so that it's lined up with the edge of the presser foot, okay? Then you're going to, it says change pattern selector to C. So your pattern selector right here, you're gonna change that to C. Okay, don't forget after this is done to change it back to A. And now you don't have to do any back stitching. This is probably one of the easiest steps. You just go straight like this. And you just keep it lined up with the edge of that presser foot. Don't get your finger near the needle like I just did. Okay, when you're done, just turn your handle towards you, lift your presser foot, take it out, cut your threads, and it should look something like this. Okay, if it doesn't look like this, maybe you're going a little too fast, maybe your fabric is not very good quality. There's a couple different reasons, but it should look at least something similar to that, okay? All right, so now we got that step. We're gonna go to the next one. It says open seam sample and fold edge towards wrong side twice using the double fold. So let's talk about what that means. But before I forget, I'm gonna change the pattern selector back to A because we're gonna be doing a straight stitch for the next one, okay? So what this last step represents for you is it represents doing the brim on your pillowcase. Okay, so the brim is the top part where it's gonna be folded in your pillowcase, okay? So what you're gonna do is you're gonna take your seam sample, you're gonna open it up like this, okay? And you're going to be able to do the double fold, all right? And so this is the wrong side. So you always wanna do your folding towards the wrong side or the inside, okay? So we're gonna actually take this over to the ironing board and we're gonna actually be able to iron this flat and iron it open, okay? So I'm just gonna go ahead, we're gonna bring the iPad over here to the ironing board. Okay, so I'm at the ironing board over here. I'm gonna take my iron, I'm gonna plug it in over here. We're going to look at this little knob right here and we're gonna decide, okay, what kind of fabric do I have? I know this is 100% cotton, so I'm gonna do it on the cotton setting. Okay, if you have other types of fabric, you might need to turn it down. If you're not sure, just turn it down to the silk wool setting or the polyester setting. So for mine, I'm gonna do it at the cotton setting. And if I'm not sure, I'm gonna do it at the silk wool setting, which is a little bit lower. It'll take a little bit to warm up. Okay, so I'm just gonna wait for that to happen over here. And when I iron, I'm going to take the iron and I'm just gonna iron the seam allowance down. It'll iron this open, okay? And you're gonna do something similar when we do this on the pillowcase. Okay, so now the iron's ready to go. Oh, I forgot my pins and my seam gauge. Will you please grab me some pins and my seam gauge from over there, please, quickly? Okay. Those are pretty important. All right, so now it's ready to go. So I'm gonna go ahead and just iron that flat. Don't burn yourself. Okay, so now see how flat that looks compared to before. It still sticks up a little bit, so I'm gonna iron the other side too. Okay, and got pins and seam gauge. Thank you. All right, so let's say that it's not working really well or I can't get it to be as straight as I want. You can use the spray bottle and you could just do a light spritz. You don't need to drench it or anything, and you can just iron that down and make it flat, okay? All right, so mine is really heavily ironed now. So now I'm gonna do the double fold. So on your instructions, it'll tell you to do a double fold at 1/2 inch. Now, I don't want you to do the double fold over here where your pivot was. I want you to do it on the other side so it's easier for me to see. So you're gonna go ahead and fold that at a 1/2 inch. You're gonna get your seam gauge. This is the 1 inch, the 1/2 inch is this line right there. So you're just gonna line your little seam gauge up right there. You're gonna fold this towards the wrong side. You're gonna measure that at the 1/2 inch. Make sure it's right. Then you're gonna fold it again. And you can do this at your table. You don't have to do it at the ironing board. I'm just doing it here because we're gonna iron again in a minute. So I'm measuring that right here. Now notice it's not quite right. It's a little bit off. So I'm gonna fix that a little bit to make sure that it's a 1/2 inch. And now it's perfect at a 1/2 inch. So I'm gonna spread my 2 fingers apart right here to hold it tight. And then I'm gonna take the pin and I'm gonna stab it through twice. So stab, stab. So you have to go all the way through all the layers 2 times. So it'll look like this, so your pin is here, okay? So now I'm gonna just scoot down the way a couple of inches and measure it again. Make sure you measure every time that you pin. That's important. And I'm going to go ahead and stab, stab again, okay? So it should look like this at this point. So now I'm gonna iron that over the pins here. Do not get the plastic balls, but you can do it over the pins, that's fine. You can also do it without, but I find that beginner students do better in this method here. Okay, you wanna make sure that it's nice and firm and flat. Now we're gonna take it back over to the sewing machine and we're gonna sew. Okay, we're gonna go back over here and we're gonna sew. Okay, so this time we're gonna line it up in a completely different spot than we had it before. Just wanna make sure that this is threaded correctly. Okay, so now we want to sew right close to this inside edge here. If you struggle to keep that lined up, you can actually draw, if you wanted to, you could draw a little line right there with a pencil or a pen if you're struggling to keep it lined up. We're gonna be lining it up right there so that your edge is lined up right along this little corner right here. So can you go ahead and zoom in right there so they could see where it's supposed to be lined up? Okay, so notice how the line is right here. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and show right here a little bit more closely. It's gonna look like that, where it's lined up just right with this little corner, how there's a little curve that goes right there, okay? So you need to line it up right there to make sure that it's nice and close to the edge and so that your fold doesn't come out. Okay, so we're gonna sew that really quick. And then once you're done with this step, you're gonna have the teacher check you off and write your name on it and turn it into the turn-in slot, and you'll be done with your seam sample. So back to a straight stitch, do the back stitching. You're gonna just watch right there, keep it lined up. You get close to the pin, you stop and take it out. You're gonna keep going right over your folds, right over the seam allowance. And then you're just gonna take that and cut that. And then go ahead and just write your name on that and turn it in after you've checked it off with the teacher. Thanks.